Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Society of Academic Emergency Medicine's Research Learning Series, or RLS. I'm Judah Crimebrook. I'm a current third-year medical student and MHSC and clinical research candidate at Duke University. I'm delighted to be monitoring this session called Don't Get Lost in Big Data, Tips and Tricks for Data Collection and Management. We have a great panel today of emergency physicians and researchers. With us is Dr. Priyanka Vakalanka. She's an assistant professor and research and analysis team lead within the Department of Emergency Medicine at the University of Iowa and holds an adjunct faculty appointment in the Department of Epidemiology at the University of Iowa College of Public Health. Dr. Vakalanka is trained as an epidemiologist and has over 15 years of experience with study design, data management, and quantitative data analysis. Also with us is Dr. Robert Turr, who's an assistant professor in the Department of Emergency Medicine at UT Southwestern Medical Center. He serves as a core faculty member with the Clinical Informatics Center and is the program director for the Clinical Informatics Fellowship and Deputy Chief Medical Informatics Officer for Analytics. As a researcher, he's patient-facing technologies, including patient portals. We're excited to have you both as we jump into our panel on data management and research. So with that, I think the agenda for today is to start off with an introduction to why should we care about data management and research. I think as a young researcher, as I've started off, it seems very simple. It seems like something that everyone should know, but I was wondering if you guys could shed some light into what you feel is the importance of effective data management in EM research.
I guess if I wanted to talk about the importance of effective data management, I think it all comes down to about efficiency and quality. Those are the things I like to focus on first, especially the goal is if you're going to do it, you want to do it right the first time. And the other piece of this is I tell all of our residents and our junior faculty in emergency medicine that we train because our analysis team oversees all of the projects that go through in a somewhat centralized way. Research in emergency medicine for a non-clinician is not like practice in emergency medicine. I like to stress the fact that you're probably used to moving quickly and getting things going and knocking things out. But when it comes to research, you got to slow it down. And we spend a lot of time in the planning phase because we want to do it right the first time. And it would just be terrible to collect all these data and then to find out that you missed an important covariate or an important variable. And so that's my main thing. If you want to do it effectively, you've got to think through it and spend the time in the design phase.
Dr. Tur, what do you have to add to that?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think where I hope I can add some additional perspectives, I think Dr. Vakalanka is going to do a better job of describing some of the perspectives from the researcher's perspective as a more experienced researcher, where I hope to bring some perspective that I think will be useful is from the IR or the IT side, and in particular, thinking about what sort of things wind up holding projects up when the requests come in too far along the way, right? And often what winds up happening is that people have already gotten their grant funding and put sort of a line item of, we'll talk about informatics stuff, but we'll just deal with it later once we have the money. And we're not really going to think about it too much. And that applies very soundly to your data management practices and really understanding the feasibility of the things that you're hoping to extract and the complexity of those extractions, the security implications of it, and whether those asks are realistic. And that's the kind of thing that the pervasive thread, if you want to learn anything from my perspective today, it's that as you are putting your grant application together or starting a project or things during the early stages, involve your informaticist, whether that is an EM physician informaticist, if it's somebody in your health system, if it's one of the data analysts that facilitates data extraction at your site. I couldn't agree more on the sentiment of you got to start early because it is the bones of everything else that you're doing. And if you're dealing with garbage data, doesn't matter what techniques you're using, your methodology isn't going to save you from poor data. We'll leave it at that so we can keep moving.
Yeah, sounds great. I think kind of just to sum up what I heard you both say is it's the backbone of everything you're about to do in research. And it's really important to kind of get that right the first time so that you're not actually going quickly at first, but then spending more time having to go back, collect more data, alter data, etc. So how do you guys guide folks through developing a data management plan for your research, right? Dr. Tur, you'd mentioned some folks kind of gloss over that. They might mention it in a grant application, but what would you say is like the ideal? How should you go about developing a data management plan?
I think this is a good situation where if you want to answer first again in terms of your perspective as the researcher putting together a project and your SAP and everything else, and then we can think about how you sort of bring that back in on the back end.
So we have a pretty standard, for example, when I think about our trainees, especially, we have a pretty standard proposal request that everyone fills out from the background through the questions, how everything's going to be operationalized, the data sources, and thinking about bias. So we have everyone work through that. And this may be a little frustrating for some because I will send it back and there may be multiple iterations of this work plan, but that's usually how we started. We also, not just the words that are being used, or it's also thinking about what are the data sources? What is coming from there? What is the linkage? What are you trying to do? And so I think that each of these requires a different step. So it may start off, every plan would probably just start off on a Word document, and then we build from there. Okay, these are the types of things you're collecting. These are the types of things you want to collect. How would you operationalize it? Like sleep. Okay, you want to measure sleep? Great. Sleep is a concept, but then how are you operationalizing sleep? Is it, are you binning them? Are you collecting them? Are you having a remote device that's collecting them? Is it self-reported? So walk through every piece of this. Don't just move on until you have like that roadmap or that blueprint.
Couldn't agree more. And the quote, the quote in the chat sort of hits that sentiment perfectly. So to consult a statistician after an experiment is finished is often merely to ask him to conduct a postmortem examination. He could perhaps say what the experiment defined of. On the other side of this, once you've put this dictionary together and you've translated these clinical or research-oriented concepts into more structured terms in a more structured dictionary, the way that I think about things from an architecture perspective, and this scales up to a lot of the big systems, whether you're asking this of a small single site study to try and make sure we're bringing at least some big data into this since it's in the name of the conversation. But really, big data is made up of aggregations of small data, either from many sources or from many versions of the same thing. I love it. And from that perspective, we always try to think about the entire life cycle of data as it's being created. So when we'll often do those same steps of helping a researcher understand, hey, those concepts aren't necessarily going to be translatable the way that they are, and try to get more scoped in. But often we're working with experienced researchers who come with a well-polished dictionary like you're describing. And what we try to do is we start at the clinical workflow and understand where the data are generated and where those data structures are generated. Then we need to understand how they percolate through the system into the different reporting structures that exist. For us, we're an Epic shop. We need to know those systems here, but it doesn't really matter. It's relatively agnostic depending on where you are. And then you need to understand sort of the capabilities of doing that in the back end. I don't think those concepts differ at all as you get into some of the bigger data sources, whether you're using something like a Trinetics, which IBM aggregates from EHRs of many different types from across the country. If you're dealing with Odyssey and OMOP, which same thing, you're sort of getting data from a wide range of sources, but who have tried to homogenize their structure, or you're dealing with something like Epic Cosmos, where you're dealing with, in theory, very similar data because it's all from the same system, but sort of dealing with the consequences of customization. It's one of those things where the process to get to the data dictionary explains the idealized state, and then working with somebody like an informaticist or a data engineer can help you to understand the real world implications of that translation and where maybe the practicalities of data capture and things like that may have gone wrong and may impact your plans or your methodology.
It makes a lot of sense. So just thinking about, would you say you would recommend to start with the idealized form and then work your way backwards, or more like start in the middle and then work your way up? Which way do you think is ideal?
I think you always have to start with the problem you're trying to solve and go outwards from there, or inwards, depending on how you're thinking about it. But these problems are much easier if you've got a really well-defined and well-structured research question in this case, or operational problem you're trying to solve in an operations situation. And I know some of the folks on here, I don't know how many folks are students versus, I see at least several faculty or post-fellowship people, but it just goes back to the foundations. A good research question is going to lead to structured outcomes and structured covariates. And those structured ideas, even if they don't perfectly align with the system, are much easier to work with and much easier to translate. And so the first steps, no matter what, are going to be the same. It's just like emergency medicine, right? We tend not to get beat up when we miss the zebra. We tend to get beat up when we miss our ABCs and we miss the foundations. So I don't really see how in many ways that this is any different.
That's great. So would you say that as far as going about identifying data sources, and could you guys clarify like what is the difference between something that's called a primary data source versus a secondary data source? You hear those terms thrown out a lot, but could you guys give us some insight into that?
I can take this one. When I primary versus secondary, we think about who's collecting the data for what purpose. Primary often involves you as the researcher or your team who's seeking out this information, collecting it. You know, your patients might be the source. For example, or you're conducting a prospective type of study, or say a case control study that would still be collecting some information based on the past retrospective. Whereas secondary data sources, they're already created. And the one thing is they're already created, sometimes for a different purpose. So secondary data sources can include structured data sets from the CDC on a national level, from SAMHSA, from other institutes, HRQ, for example. There may be other forms which include like administrative data, EPIC, and all of that, which are not designed for research. The first, great, some of these existing data, secondary data sources are there, but some of the issues with that is it still wasn't collected for you. So maybe your exact research question won't have the variables, or you may have missing confounders. And this goes back to the data dictionary. You really want that data dictionary available and knowing what's in and not in there. And then some of the other things with primary, you're doing this, you get to decide what you're collecting, when you're collecting, how you're collecting, and have this protocol in place. But then there are trade-offs there too: efficiency, time, resources, money, people, all of that.
Mm.
And I guess the only one other thing I wanted to add is that when you're trying to decide, these are trade-offs, whether it's primary or secondary, but what you decide, there's gonna be multiple sources of error. Some is random error, some is on the quality, some is on variability of how people collect and put in data. All of this could lead to bias. And like what Dr. Turner was saying earlier, if there's a lot of garbage in there, a lot of noise, then it doesn't matter what your results are because you can't trust them. And then how do you interpret them?
Do you have anything to add to, I think you probably work with secondary data a lot.
All the time. The only thing that I might throw out there is, like with anything in development and design, if you can avoid reinventing the wheel, you should. And knowing that things like the Squire guidelines exist for reusing data collected for routine use, but basically being reused. And more recently, there was a revision to that is better. That is slipping my mind. And as soon as I remember it, I will put it in the chat.
That's good. And so with collection methods, obviously if there's secondary data, let's say that you're using that secondary data and you have to recode it, or if you're collecting primary data, what do you all typically use for your, electronic data capture? And what do you think the advantages of various software or databases are? I'm sure this probably varies from shop to shop, but what perspective can you give us on that?
I think the order that we've got here is working really well because it's right. We're thinking about the researcher first, and then we're going to think about the areas where we may run into issues downstream that we may not have thought of. So I'd love your perspectives to start.
Okay. Yeah, okay, that sounds good. And I think I'll defer to you on some of the more like IT aspects too, especially with your expertise in our department. One of the greatest changes I think that started just before I got here and is now the only direction we're going to go in is basically we're not going to touch investigator generated CSVs. I still get them, but I don't want them. We love, the free text going in and the errors and all that kind of stuff. It's like an analyst nightmare. We really push for REDCap, especially for defined projects, and no matter whether they're small in scope or large. And I think there are many reasons for that. This is something I teach. I co-teach a class in clinical epidemiology, which is a mix of clinicians and public health students. And so one of the things is just knowing the amount of control that you have in creating the data, and not to get ahead because I know that there's a question about this later, but about the quality of the data going in, the logging aspects, the multiple people can access it. It's just, I probably just cringe every time I get a raw data set in CSV that wasn't exported from something structured like
Yep.
REDCap.
Yeah, I think that matches some recent experience I've had where I've told teams that I will not be taking part in research, which is done in Excel for recording. And I've just like drawn that kind of boundary of even at this stage, like I want to build good practices now. So it's
That's
good.
great.
Yeah, I think the only thing I would add is we often find people trying to push REDCap beyond its limits where there are other tools that are safe. And I think this is, by definition, such an institutionally dependent thing that it just highlights again, you just need to make friends with the people who are bridging that gap between understanding the information systems at your shop and the research offices, because there are probably more systems available to you for handling data, especially data that's being reused for other things that is totally safe and totally appropriate and may be more powerful depending on what you're trying to do. And I have seen all sorts of things where people are really trying to push for, and I want to be clear, there is a right time and a right place for things like EHR REDCap integration. 100%, both from a workflow and a data flow perspective, there are right times for that. There are also times where it seems like we are reinventing a second system when the first system already exists and has adequate exporting and visualization and analytic capabilities on its own. And it's already gone through a business affiliate agreement. And so you're already safe to use it for both either operational or research purposes. And sometimes that little bit of extra patience to find the right tool instead of going to the thing that you're used to can sometimes be a better choice. But it is such a site-by-site thing that I hesitate to give. For example, some of the REDCap to Epic integration, if you're dealing with very granular concepts, especially the changing concepts over time with certain data elements, or if you're dealing with large volumes of, using Epic as an example, large volumes of flow sheets, they may not all be set up. And the amount of effort for a research informatics team to maintain those connections or to build new ones for your study compared to just using existing reporting tools and analytics tools elsewhere, oftentimes is sort of a missed opportunity. On the other side, there are a lot of times where, I've seen people redoing things in REDCap where you could just pull the data and then with a quick merge with the REDCap template, you could pre-populate large volumes of your study information and save your RAs or your analysts a lot of time. So it kind of goes in both directions. But again, sort of the specific tool just depends on the job in terms of, and the people that you have on your team. Do you have data scientists who can do this? Do you have statisticians who can do this sort of work? Often who is doing the work, what they're comfortable with may dictate that. But I sometimes just see people getting a little bit stuck in the REDCap world, sometimes more than is needed. Another place where I've seen this is there's the strange line between whether you use REDCap or an EHR system for doing surveys or questionnaire type situations, which is always a really interesting and complicated discussion.
Yeah, it's kind of
Oh,
one of our questions that's coming up, but I have like an institutional example of this. So here at Duke, there's been studies that I've done the kind of Epic to REDCap integration, but there are also studies where on the back end of our informatics tools, we can actually pull that data out, and it's so much faster to just grab a data element that I thought I originally needed to abstract manually, but really I could just pull it in. What would you say as far as going to surveys really quick? How do you create and deploy surveys and questionnaires usually? I know REDCap has functionality. There's some institutions that use Qualtrics. What do you guys recommend?
At least for us, I think it depends on some of the questions, what you're trying to ask, who you're trying to send it to. Our institution does use both REDCap and Qualtrics. For my class, I sometimes use Qualtrics if I'm trying to get sort of a different type of information. And I think Qualtrics definitely for some surveys in the past, we've also used for some things, we've used like SurveyMonkey as well. But at least Qualtrics, I think, would also still be like HIPAA compliant and being mindful of that. I think some of it might be user preference too.
I just put a paper that a mentor of mine wrote that sort of goes into the other aspect of this, which is surveys, questionnaires, things like that, anything going directly to folks. Some of this is more about validated, like true pros and true proms, but a lot of the same principles apply in terms of tool selection and sort of what you're using the data for and how much of this is going to be reused for clinical care versus just primarily for research. And that often is the first line of questioning that I use if people ask me about how to choose a tool for survey-based research. And again, this is like a little bit parallel, not an exact thing, but it provides some frameworks that I think could be useful.
Sounds good. Thanks for sharing. And then what would you say as far as these kind of odd data types that often I think folks worry about regulatory, but also the logistics of how to collect this data? So data, direct observation of resuscitation bays, trauma, et cetera. And then patient interview data. So qualitative research often uses recordings of various types. What can you provide there?
I think I'll defer to Dr. Turer on the other portions, but some of the things that we do when it comes to interviews right now, because some of our projects are very much related to systems level of care and interviewing healthcare personnel, and depending on that type, sometimes we might just use something like Zoom, because especially if it's not considered human subject research, and so then we can also allow Zoom to help us start transcribing it. And then obviously once you get into more secure data that may have more identifiers, maybe more personal at the patient level, I think that there are other methods that you could use to record and maintain that in a safe place that you predetermined. This is going into your IRB, exactly where things are being stored, where they're going to be kept. So I think that if you're at the stage of recording this, you already have that plan. If you
Yeah.
haven't figured that out, that means something's wrong, something is missing here.
Yeah, the only thing I'd add is exactly to your point in terms of as the risk of the data collected goes up. And again, like looking at the current audience on the call, half of these people have trained me at various points. So it's less for them and more for the recording and posterity. But this is just one of those things where sometimes the temptation, and I think everybody on this call probably knows this from firsthand experience. Sometimes there's that temptation of like, I don't think it's that big of a deal. We're going to just do this and kind of see how it goes. This tool should be fine. We use it all the time for this. It should be fine for that. The more sensitive the data are, the more you need to really ask yourself, did I do a good, honest assessment of this? Do I need to have a conversation with legal, risk, and compliance? Because you just never know how things are going to get handled or mishandled, or if there's going to be a leak someday and what the implications would be if that happens. And sometimes things wind up beyond your control, even if it's sort of allowed or within the rules. And so as the risk of the data being captured increases, beyond your typical IRB assessment, you really do need to consider whether that's something that puts your subject or your institution at risk, which I think we all would think about in a more interventional setting, but sometimes because it's observational, you can probably get it through in the IRB, often as an exempt study. And it's just, I don't think it'd be as heavily scrutinized. And I think it's on the researcher to just say, is there some way that this could backfire against the subject, the institution, or on me before proceeding?
A lot of sense. You guys have actually answered some of the questions that we had already had planned. And I think that brings us to the last question of this section, which is how does somebody go about finding institutional support for a particular type of tool, right? Let's say your institution is yet to invest in a tool that you think is useful. Have you guys ever had to do that? What recommendations do you have?
I think within our group, we're constantly learning things. And one other nice thing is, ask IT and ask the infrastructure and the people who are in charge of that. We have our Institute for Clinical and Translational Science, who does a lot of the work related to the different EHRs and just talking and pulling data. And they're usually my first source because they know how to do it. Or if they don't, they know exactly who to ask. And our chief health information officer too here is very accessible. We even invite him to teach in our class because he brings up a lot of issues related to data collection, management, storage, compliance, what's new. And so I learned something by inviting him every year because I know, oh, you didn't talk about this last year. So, you get a little bit of the latest tech that the institution is implementing. And then the other thing is, as a point of contact, I usually just know who to approach after that. We do have one thing is we have these, I'm butchering this, but we just call them supercomputers, but it's the high performing computer clusters. And that's something that is really helpful to our analysis team when we're dealing with very large scale data, but those are not HIPAA compliant. So then we have to make sure that anyone who's using that knows there can't be any sensitive data going there. It needs to be de-identified in some way.
I think your point about how important having a liaison is just going to get more and more true. We are figuring out our cloud strategy for a lot of our data warehouses locally, as well as sort of how research infrastructure is going to fit into that. And I just think the world is going to just continue to change at faster and faster paces. And just sort of knowing some of the informatics people at your shop and at ours, I know this is easier at some places than others. And if anybody is ever listening to this and you got to start somewhere, right? So whether it's following up with your local IR group, almost all of these larger institutions, though, whether it's somebody through, if you have a CTSA, often there is somebody there who can at least be the first part of the rabbit trail to get you where you're trying to go. if you don't have like a specific research support services, but things are changing fast enough that what you used last time is often not the right thing for right now because things are just really rapidly changing.
And then what would you say? I heard you guys mention security, compliance, making sure that you're using those tools. What are some like secure compliant storage options? And then what are maybe some that people might think they are, but they're not? I think that.
There's two pieces to this, right? There's the technical answer to this, but there's also the regulatory answer to this. And most people think about the technical answer and they're like, oh, Office 365 is HIPAA compliant. A tool cannot be HIPAA compliant until there is a business affiliate agreement. So until you have actually set up the agreement between your institution and the vendor and the contracts are signed with all of that done with your legal department reviewing, that is what makes something safe from that perspective. It's not just the tool, it's the tool plus the relationship. So this is one of those things where you cannot, if somebody at a different site tells you, oh, we use this for that, that is not blanket approval that it's going to be safe or approved somewhere else. For instance, the state of Texas has very rigorous expectations that every piece of software used at a state-owned institution has to follow. And certain software that I used at other institutions doesn't meet those requirements, either because they just haven't, you could ask them and maybe they'll review it, or it was missing something that was important. And so it just kind of goes back to the thread of this conversation, which is it's good to have a friend in your informatics or research informatics division who can help you sort of assess this for your particular project at a given state and time.
Yeah, and don't just give up on one thing, like push. Like you got to just keep pushing and asking until you get your answer. I might even like sometimes think of going with a higher level of security and until told otherwise to drop down a notch, just to, I's and T's.
Yeah, yeah. It makes a lot of sense. I've often tried to overshoot so that I don't have to like toe a line, and that's been helpful in a lot of my projects. What would you say are some like backup strategies? I think folks often worry about like, what if the data gets wiped, or what if somebody updates data in one area and not the other? What do you think about just like backup strategies so that you're tracking your data so you know which version is up to date?
This may be a very basic answer, but I try to stress this even like within my team. Don't put anything on your C drive, And then the other thing, because people still do. And then the other thing I try to stress is at least like knowing what the cycle of backup is within your institution is also really important because we all encounter that. And I think something else, I have a lot of people in my team who work on, it's a backed up drive, but it's their personal drive. And we also have a shared drive. And in the shared drive for our research team, we all have access. So my thing is, please put your programs, your analyses, all of that in one of those places so that if someone gets hit by a bus too, not just some losing data, but like we have something in place, the codes, the programming, all of that, the data sets, they're all in there that anyone who's then gains access to that in the future can pick right up where another analyst, for example, left off. So I think like there's security, but then also you want some level of visibility too. And then some standard conventions about standardized naming and dating of things.
I love all that. A few things additionally to think about just in your everyday life. Almost every academic center is on Microsoft 365. There are more version control tools than I think people are aware of for keeping track of versions of your documents and things like that. But honestly, I don't know if it's worth demoing, but just some really easy things that you can do. I can pull up an example here that doesn't show any sort of PHI or anything. So trying to switch to a viewer, I can see how many of you guys are using Microsoft, including Teams and SharePoint, that whole stack. I'm assuming most people. So if you go, first of all, realizing that a lot of these things are on the same stack. So right, Teams is just a wrapper around SharePoint in a lot of ways. OneDrive is just a wrapper around SharePoint. And as an example, we have a block schedule that we're using for our fellowship. And I'll share, this is not research related, but the same principles apply here, one way or the other. And so, let's say I want to see what's been going on. There are features that allow you to do a couple of things to keep your documents safe and deal with multiple people accessing them, which isn't necessarily the question that you asked, but is in many ways where things go awry. So if you look out the checkout feature, I can check out this document, go edit it. And then after I'm done editing, I can go check it back in and it'll say, hey, what did you do? And then there will be, then if you go and view this on SharePoint, and I'm going to just switch screens real quick, and you go to version history, you can see who's doing what, and you can go backwards. Sometimes this is happening on its own, and again, it will depend on what's going on, but we've asked folks to document when they're changing the group calendar so that we have a consistent documentation for it. And this is just easy stuff that almost all of us have access to. There's no reason you can't use this for your research, your protocols and things like that. One thing that I have still not totally come together on in my personal practice with these tools is I've had research friends lose large volumes of data on OneDrive, because at the end of the day, even though it's a highly resilient and highly redundant set of systems, even Microsoft screws up sometimes. And so if it's something that like your livelihood really profoundly depends upon and your institution has a second source, Dr. Vakalanka was saying, once a year, put some of this stuff somewhere else so that you've got a backup of your core protocols. From a data perspective, this is one place where if you're doing primary capture, this is a huge advantage to RedCap. They've got a lot of security features in there. And the way that you can export data provides you the ability to do that redundancy for yourself, where in addition to their own security and backup planning, you can put this on whatever other secure storage you have at your site by exporting that data, exporting the XML behind your project so that you know that you can always rebuild it at any point if either something breaks or the system dies or something like that. And then for larger volumes of data, if you're dealing with very special, very expensive data in whatever you mean by expensive, hard to get, rare diseases, whatever that meaning is, that's another place to work with your IR team and see whether you can have a more robust data system set up, whether that's an actual SQL Server database or something like that, depending on the systems that you use. And having a real DBA who can think through your data engineering strategy, do that in a way where you're unlikely to lose something important and that things are more redundantly maintained. Obviously, that is going to depend platform-wise, comfort-wise from site to site. And those principles of redundancy and careful audit tracking and logging don't really change from system to system, but just some more pragmatic ways to think about that at different places.
Awesome. That's a great introduction to what I think we all should be doing, but it's hard to do sometimes when you're busy. I think that goes into how is it best to organize our data? We've talked about file naming and version control. We've talked about data dictionaries in a broad sense, but how do you start with your creation and your maintenance of your dictionaries and kind of getting that rolling? Do you guys have particular templates that you use or methods that you've perfected?
I think that some of the things, every project really should have a data dictionary. This doesn't happen anymore, but I don't like getting a data set without, I don't know what 1 and 2 mean. And for example, like unless you tell me what they mean, I don't know what the reference is. And so, this is a project form and a data dictionary kind of go together if they're going to an analyst of what the goals are, what the research question is. But sometimes we start from scratch, and when in that earlier we were talking about preparing and planning. So, after we move past the research question phase and we're thinking about data sources and how it's operationalized, if it's data extraction, say from chart review, for example, I might get a list of, okay, comorbidities. So then I'd want to know, okay, which comorbidities? How are we labeling them? How are we calling them? I have a structure in how I label variables too for my own management and keeping them organized in sort of like variable chunks. But then I want to know from the person whose question this is that I'm trying to help, are these binned? Are these, like, I would encourage continuous data to begin with, and then we'll work on creating categories. You tell me that later, but we'll collect it as raw as possible, and then we'll bin later because we can't go the other way around. And then the other thing I might do is tell me, you want this as yes or no's? Do you want this? How do you want this? Like, tell me all of the details. Is this a continuous variable? Is it a dichotomous variable? Are there categories? Are we missing anything? We keep reviewing and reviewing what they want to collect. If we're doing this in REDCap, so, REDCap will also, for example, and I bring up REDCap a lot just because I'm thinking about from the research learning series standpoint, and a lot of our trainees and the ones who are starting research with maybe a defined question, maybe a smaller data set. So from that perspective, if you label it, you create these variables in REDCap, it'll give you that data dictionary. Sometimes I use that data dictionary and import it into a new project, so it's like we're not starting from scratch. I think this theme about efficiency will come up a lot. It has been coming up too. So those are some of the ways we think about it. Sometimes people want to collect things. And then this is where it's really important to think with an analyst too, which is, okay, you're collecting it, but how are you going to use this? Like, how does this fit in with your research question? Is this a covariate? Is this a confounder? Is this how you're going to analyze it? So people need to think about how they're going to analyze it at the time of even developing the data dictionary or any collection.
I think you almost hit on causal inference at that point, right? Is think about like how do your variables relate to each other
Yeah.
before you start going like what is the relationship to your exposure and your outcome if that's what you're actually trying to do.
Yes, like get a whiteboard and, well, there's one right there. I just got a brand new whiteboard too. It's all about we draw it out and we map it out. And then we also have this category of would be nice variables and must have variables because we have to balance this efficiency standpoint too. And what are we going to do with things that we collect?
And then what would you guys say as far as setting up data so that you can reliably share and collaborate with outside collaborators? I think that's something that in some cases an outside collaborator will need the data. In many cases, the outside collaborator won't. But in those cases where they do, how do you guys normally go about doing that? Especially if there's still some identifier that for whatever reason that collaborator might need. I would imagine in most cases it's fully de-identified, but
I actually think that in some ways, the structure of the response to the last question is going to better answer this, maybe than directly answering the question. Because I think if you're asking this question, you're asking too late and you're going to get yourself in trouble, right? This is the like, oh, I had a great idea. Oh, somebody thought this was cool. We can multi-site it. That's the wrong way to do this. And I'm going to take that back because that's just the reality of how inspiration happens. You're like, oh, other people thought this was cool. Okay, how do we scale this? And that's just the reality of the situation. So it is still a good and realistic question. Ideally, though, these conversations are happening earlier, right? Because when we think about data sharing, there's really a spectrum of practices that we can use that can get us to different levels, right? And if we're dealing with observational type stuff, right, up to the level of big formal registries where people are contributing data, or these big research networks where you're dealing with very large budgets, you're going to have a very different conversation there in terms of really forward thinking database design and the way that you're approaching what you're doing. But even with these smaller studies, first the question should be, do we have to share to answer this question jointly? Because often you don't, whether it is just simply presenting findings from multiple sites next to one another because there's so much heterogeneity that they shouldn't even be put together anyway. That might be fine. And that saves you a lot of overhead in terms of all of your IRB efforts, in terms of all of your data sharing and data use agreement efforts, in terms of the actual infrastructure to do all that. And somebody has to pay for and manage all that. If you do have to combine, but don't necessarily need to combine at the row level, could you do it that way, right? You can use meta analytic techniques to do a lot of things without needing to have everybody share their entire data set. So you can see how, depending on the spectrum, by starting with the question of, again, what is our research question? Why are we doing this multi-site? And how much do we really need to share to be effective? It goes a long way in terms of quelling unease between sites. You still get to all put the feathers in your cap of saying we're doing multi-site research, but you can avoid some of the risks, some of the costs, and some of the complexities by right-sizing your sharing to the needs of the project. And the only way that happens is by thinking ahead. Again, practically speaking, often this happens. Somebody did a single site thing and was like, hey, this is cool, let's scale this. But at that point, at the very earliest possible moment is when you need to start having those conversations because it'll govern everything that follows.
I think the theme of this conversation continues to be early, not late.
Plan everything.
Plan ahead. As far as data quality, what are some data validation cleaning techniques that you think are industry standard or should be industry standard? And then what are the various options that are in the tools already?
I'll start off with some of the low-hanging fruit here before turning it back to Dr. Tor. But, I think we try our best to include as many validation tools as we can. And some programs don't offer that, which is another reason why we might not go in that direction. But whenever we have something numeric, identify the boundaries. So as a non-clinical person, if someone tells me, oh, I want to collect these vitals and these clinical measures, okay, tell me the lowest possible and the highest possible that this could be. And I asked our clinical team to tell me these things so then I can help program it. So then you start entering 5,000 for heart rate, even I know that one. So then it doesn't take it because it just says that's an invalid, or you're looking for integers, or people accidentally type in letters instead. So as you're creating the field, you can identify this is a date and this is exactly how I want the date to look. Okay, this is a numerical value. I only want integers. These are letters. I only want this. Date of birth, you can put a cap of 1915 if you want. So things like that. I think that certain tools offer validation. In our group, one process we have is whenever someone on the team creates a red cap, 2 other people will QA that red cap form and look for these things like validation techniques, considering, did you think about this variable or that variable? Like, we've already kind of gotten to this point, but this is somebody who's not been involved in the project from the beginning as like an outside perspective on how, what else can you think of? And this came out of a misstep that happened like 8 or 9 years ago where a very important variable was left out. That's why now this is the process for anybody who's going to have REDCap, like or a data collection tool, someone to QA it. So I think validation is really important. Especially again, I said this at the beginning, but free text, I won't do it. I don't have time for this. You should have planned this better of how to collect this. I work around that. We make it happen if we have to. But I just think that there are lots of steps involved with validation that we should use more.
This is one of the few areas where I'm going to concede and just say validation is up front, cleaning's on the back, because no matter how many times we try to anticipate this stuff happens, right? And being flexible enough to think through your cleaning techniques at the end and think through, okay, let's have a structured way. The biggest mistake that I have made on the back end, because I think we've covered the needs on the front end for the most part, is not documenting granularly enough as you're going with the cleaning, because the nature of that early part of an analysis is exploratory. Even if you have a very pre-specified SAP, at some level, you're looking at the big picture view, at the distributions of the data, and looking at the areas where you may have made a mistake or you may have missed something. And again, we've had the exact same thing where I think we had 3 CMIOs, a bunch of analysts, and several statisticians look at the survey, and somehow we forgot to ask what people's sex or gender status was. Went out to like 30,000 people, and you're like, okay, like 10 people looked at this and not one person put it together. It's just this stuff happens sometimes. And cleaning really comes in when you're having to think through your process. And the fact is you can still make most things work and find ways to make it work, but only if you document it, because at the end of the day, the rigor of what you're doing and ultimately the reviewers are incredible at figuring out when you forgot to do stuff, because they're going to see it much faster than you will. And if you documented your process, you can at least justify some of those issues. And I unfortunately don't have an immediate fancy technical response to this other than it will be interesting to see over the next few years how this task is going to change as we get better and better at automating it. I think it's going to become more about sort of anomaly detection and the correction than necessarily sort of what we consider to be the arduous task of doing it ourselves right now.
I think a lot of us are looking forward to that day, but also wondering how accurate it's going to be. And
one of those, be careful what you wish for. Annoying work is redundant and annoying, but at least it's interpretable and simple. As we've all seen, uninterpretable concepts can get scary quickly. So we'll see where this lands.
These are some of the things I would say for like a conversation with an analyst too, but some of the things that I discuss in like our team, we all talk about for best practices is annotate our programs like crazy. Like our team, we have SAS users, we have R, Stata, and so we're pretty agnostic to the type of data management programs that we use. We can figure things out and talk about it conceptually, but the SAS people talk to the SAS people about QA code, and then the R people help each other out. So thankfully we have enough of those people, but everything about the documentation, I annotate it in my SAS code, like for outputting a flow chart of your sample, your figure 1, for example, like every step of exclusion that is applied, or we made a decision because of some issue, everything is documented so that when you're looking at the 6 months down the road, writing up a manuscript, which I also try to stress, try to do it together. Don't wait till the end to write. But these are also best practices as part of data cleaning, management, preparation for publication.
Yeah, I think you just brought up something that has changed my life is this idea of like pre-drafting a manuscript with the intro methods because you already know what you're going to do. And then if you deviate from it, then you can deviate and update your methods. And before you know it,
Absolutely.
you have your table shells that you put in your SAP and all that. What do you think the most common mistakes that EM investigators at your institution just in I think just broadly make other than I think we've heard a lot of not coming early enough, right? Is there anything specific, even with those that come early, maybe that you guys notice maybe we need more structured processes or they could benefit from a session like this?
Okay, I'm trying to think past the start early phase because that I think takes care of a lot of issues. And we also have this process. She's our director of research education. And so, every time we meet as an analyst and we send out exact notes of what happened in that meeting, what decisions were made, and what timelines are being made. I'm going off topic a little bit, but in terms of structure, that's our main structure to have these immediate sort of meeting minutes that come out from everything. Because for me, I really can't remember things a week later. And then people say, we talked about this. And I'm like, that sounds like something I would say, but I don't really remember that. So I think that's the main thing. Other than that, continuous communication, like check-ins, because I don't think it's to go silent for 5 months and then suddenly I think that we need to stay up to date. So like I tell doctoral students too, even if there's nothing to report, check in and just provide some kind of status that things are moving along. So communication, documentation, planning, I think are the first things that come to mind.
Yeah, that's great. And Dr. Tara, what would you add to that as far as things?
Oh, I even wrote a note for myself, rushing. So that actually I wrote rushing because that is a common theme. Sorry.
I don't know. I think that's even probably different than early, right? Because like there you could come early,
Yes.
but you're still going fast, right? And all of us who are in and around emergency medicine, like going fast
Yeah.
is how people get things done, right?
Again, I think the biggest mistake is not the only thing that we haven't talked about, which is another theme of early, is maybe people have thought about their analysis, but they haven't thought about the costs. And they haven't thought about the cost of having essentially what is going to amount to either another co-investigator if you're having somebody like me on the grant, or the cost of analysts beyond sort of your local people who are doing your collection. But if you're dealing with these sort of bigger systems things, those people spend a lot of time and that time costs a lot of money. And I think thinking about this at the early budgetary stage, and again, the people on this call, I think, are teaching this rather than necessarily learning this because for the prior comment, but that is in terms of things that like really, a lot of things you can course correct. That's really hard to course correct if you didn't budget for a core team or a core group of people that are really pivotal for a data centric or information system centric project, which many of them are these days. So to me, if I had to leave one thing, it is make sure you are engaging with your informaticist or equivalent early in the project, either at the budgetary stage for a grant or in the early design stage for an unfunded paper.
Awesome. Thank you both for coming on and having this conversation with us. I think this has been, I know for myself, a really good learning opportunity. I feel like I've walked away with probably even 5 or 6 takeaways in these various sections on just how to be a better researcher myself. So thank you.
Thank you too. And thanks, Dr. Tur. I learned a lot from you as well.
Likewise, appreciate you guys having us.